First, it was the DACA program. Then it was temporary protected status, or TPS, for migrants from El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Sudan. And now the Trump administration is giving another group of immigrants with special legal status an eviction notice. 20 families who have been allowed to stay in the country to get treatment at Boston hospitals, including Boston Medical Center, now have less than a month to leave the country and find treatment elsewhere for life-threatening diseases, including cancer, HIV, cystic fibrosis, and others. Citizenship and immigration officials told the families last week that they no longer consider deferred action requests except for certain military members and their families, and that if they fail to depart the United States within 33 days, they might be deported, which would bar them from coming back to the U.S. for at least 10 years. But, like the futures of DACA and TPS, both of which are being litigated right now, this move is likely to face legal challenges. The Director of Immigration Legal Services for the Irish International Immigrant Center, Anthony Marino, joins me now, along with Commonwealth Magazine reporter Sarah Betancourt, who is covering this story. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
At the outset, can you help me understand a little more about medical deferred action? Because I had not even been aware of this program. How does this work, and who gets it?
So medical deferred action is just what we call it. It's a program through which people that don't really fit well into another category of status are able to ask the immigration service for permission to stay. It's an acknowledgement by the immigration service that a person is deportable, but USCIS can say, while we could deport you, we're opting not to because we acknowledge the urgency of your situation, the humanitarian need, and they can give those granted deferred action authorization to work in the United States and to remain while their treatment is ongoing without having to face deportation.
So it's something that people usually get after they have entered the country already. Am I right about that?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's for people who are here. In most cases, and certainly I believe all of the cases that we have, they're people who initially entered on tourist visas. It's people who are either just coming for a visit and then a child fell ill or became injured, or it's somebody who came in as a visitor for a doctor's appointment to get medical treatment and find out when they get here that this treatment's going to take a lot longer than they're allowed to stay as a visitor.
There are 20 families. How many of these, by the way, are families where children are getting treatment? I know it's a number of them, but not all of them, if I'm correct about that.
So actually, when I was talking to USCIS about this, they weren't able to give a certain amount of these are children, these are adults, but I think from the press conference today, it seemed like a significant amount of people were children.
So I think that number 20 maybe comes from us. I know that in my office, we have 19 families who are either in this status or had pending initial applications for this status. So the number is probably much higher. I have 20 alone.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and 14 or 15 of those, I think, are sick children.
Can you describe the particulars of the cases that you know about? And we don't have time to talk about all 20 of them. But just give me some examples of the sort of people who are now facing the prospect of having to leave the country.
Sure. The list that you started with, we have people with all of those conditions: cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, a child with HIV, multiple forms of cancer we see, very severe epilepsy, a child with a condition called sudden death syndrome, which is kind of what it sounds like. They're in the middle of an epileptic seizure. They're concerned that his heart will just stop and that'll be it. So these are people who are seeking medical treatment for critical, life-threatening conditions. Right? We're not filing these applications for people with the flu. These are kids that are likely to die if they're not here receiving treatment that is only available here, or at least is not available in their home country.
Sarah, you spoke with someone who provided us a photo of, right? Can you tell me about Samuel Fonseca?
So he is a little boy who's about 5 years old. He was at the press conference earlier, and when he was 3, he was diagnosed with short bowel syndrome, which means some of his intestines are shorter than others. And when we met him today, he had a GI tube and central line, and he doesn't actually consume solid food. He's fed through that. His mother did say he needs round-the-clock care. He is now being seen at Boston's Children's Hospital pretty much weekly. Their family's from Brazil, and she received a letter from USCIS last week about this, and it was pretty shocked.
Okay.
I have to ask you, does Samuel himself have an awareness or understanding of what's happening with him and his family right now, or is this kind of over his head?
I think he's about 5 years old, so today he seemed, like most children, doesn't want to be in a very long press conference, but he seemed very tired, very attached to his mother, and, you know, dealing with a circumstance that not a lot of people anticipated.
And is his mother, is she, what does she say will happen if they have to return to Brazil?
She said they just don't have that amount of, that level of care, that kind of treatment for short bowel syndrome, and it's also such a complicated disease, and a lot of these children do have incredibly complicated health conditions. It's like Anthony was saying, it's not just the flu. In this circumstance, she said in the part of Brazil that they're from, which is not the most well-off area, doesn't have any sort of situation for this or any sort of treatment, so it's pretty much a death sentence.
Before we shift gears, can you talk a little bit about another family that you and I discussed on the phone? This was a family, I think, from Honduras, where one child is living with cystic fibrosis, but there's a backstory which makes the case even more tragic.
The family, mom and dad had lost a child to cystic fibrosis in Honduras 18 years ago, and when they lost the baby, the doctors didn't even know what this was. They didn't have a name for it. They didn't know how to diagnose it, let alone treat it. And when they had their second child, their son that they have now, he thrived more when he was younger, but as he got sick, they just knew there was no way he was going to make it in the hospital there. They didn't have the word to describe what he had, and they sent lab tests in the mail to the United States to get him diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And a hospital contacted them and invited them to come in for an appointment to follow up and see how it was going to go. And they got here, and the outlook was pretty dire. And they said that he's going to need, you know, pretty serious long-term treatment. They were admitted for 6 months. They did 6 months of treatment, and the doctors just said that's not. If we can't send you back yet, right? That's just the 6 months isn't going to cut it. And so we filed an application for them in this program. For deferred action, explain the situation. Of course, we always have the medical records and an explanation from the doctors about this, and that essentially it's a death sentence if they go back. And that was filed in January of this year, I believe. And they sat on it for 8 months, and now we're getting notices that they're not even considering these applications anymore.
They're not even considering them, not even thinking about it?
No, so in all of the denials that we've gotten, they have said that we no longer consider these applications. And they've even canceled interviews and told us not to bother sending in more evidence that they had requested before, because they just said it's done.
Sarah, you got a statement from Customs and Immigration, right?
Yes, I did.
And am I right that they say they're not canceling this, they're just changing the way it works?
So, yeah, they basically told me that they are transferring the execution of this change in policy to ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And the two categories of people that won't be subject to this are DACA recipients and military families or immigrants who have some sort of military status. But the rest will be subject to this.
And they said, if I read it correctly in that statement, which like a lot of government statements is heavy on the bureaucraties, wasn't the argument that they're shifting administration to ICE, or refresh me here, there's something about resource allocation, like the change that they are making to the way this program works is supposed to enhance ICE's ability to do its job. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
A bit, yeah.
Thank you for giving me that.
It's a little,
as
really most immigration policy, it's even more complicated than that, in that USCIS has always been the proctor of this program, even though we were discussing earlier, Anthony and I, that this goes back before even the Bush administration and the existence of the Department of Homeland Security. But in this case, it's more of we're going to give some of the work that we're technically supposed to be doing as an agency to ICE, and it's sort of punting that a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, except they didn't do that. I got denial notices. they've denied them and said we're not considering these anymore. So it's not like they didn't say we're checking in with ICE or ICE said that you can't have this.
Right.
They just denied them. And I think they're playing games here. So there are other circumstances in which ICE historically may have exercised prosecutorial discretion, and maybe that's what they're referring to.
Okay.
But as far as I know, there's no new procedure.
Botched summary that
no,
you guys are having trouble articulating the exact.
We got denials.
Here.
They're denied.
What do you think? I got to ask you. There are some steps that the Trump administration has taken with immigration where I don't necessarily view it as the right thing to be doing or the moral thing to be doing, perhaps, but I can understand the rationale. You know, if you make it incredibly difficult for people to cross the border, if points of entry are made more difficult to get through, then you might diminish immigration from the South, which is what you want to do. In this case, it's a struggle for me to wrap my brain around what the rationale would be. Do you have any theories?
I mean, it seems like the administration has a pretty hard-line approach to a lot of categories of immigrants. I mean, including DACA recipients, asylum seekers, refugees. So this sort of seems on par with the narrative.
I know a lot of people have been saying this, but really it's the cruelty is the point. I think it's just the cruelty is the point. In USCIS's response that I've seen to a couple of requests, they stated that the program is so small, and I don't necessarily trust what they're saying, but they're saying it's something like 1,000 applications a year nationwide, and that they're denying most of them. So they're talking about a few hundred, in my experience, mostly kids with cancer and debilitating diseases, and why they would be targeting them. It's not going to make a dent in anything in terms of immigration policy or flows to the United States.
And it doesn't even seem like it sends a potent symbolic message, other than
I mean, it does.
Well, point taken. What are your next steps, legally speaking, here? We've got only about 30 seconds. So
Good,
what can...
I've only got about 30 seconds because
Okay,
it's in very early stages at this point. We just found out about this, and that's an important point, that there was no announcement about any of this. We found out when our clients started getting denial letters. So we are working on strategies. I know that other organizations, the ACLU, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, are looking at strategies. The way that they've done this is problematic, and I think there may be something to challenge in the procedure itself. And then the idea that you're going to take away the discretion of an agency entirely so that they can't in any circumstances consider, I think it is contrary to all of American legal history. So there are legal challenges there.
Okay, we got to leave it there.
Sure.
Anthony Marino, Sarah Betancourt, thank you both for being here.